The delicate scratch of charcoal on paper filled the hushed library at Blackwood Manor. Sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor Vance sat beside Lady Clara Beaumont, a book open on the polished mahogany table before them, its pages yellowed with age. Clara, with her bright, inquisitive blue eyes and golden curls, patiently copied the letters Eleanor had carefully demonstrated, her small hand gripping the pencil with earnest concentration. "Miss Vance, why does the Queen in the story always wear gray?" Clara asked, her voice a soft, melodious whisper that barely disturbed the quiet. "It is such a dull color for a queen." Eleanor offered a faint smile, a gesture that did not quite reach her expressive gray eyes. "Perhaps gray is not dull to her, Clara. Sometimes it is the color of quiet strength, or perhaps of a secret sadness." Eleanor's fingers, slim and pale, traced a line in the air, a silent punctuation to her words. The scent of old books and beeswax polish hung faintly in the air, familiar and comforting in its constancy. Her own gown, a simple dark wool, felt coarse against her skin, a stark contrast to the silks and satins she had once known. A secret sadness. The words lingered in her mind, a quiet echo of her own hidden life. 2 years had passed since she shed her old identity, since she meticulously constructed this new, unassuming existence as a governess. Each day was a carefully choreographed performance, every word measured, every glance guarded. The weight of her past never truly lifted. It was a constant, invisible companion, pressing down on her shoulders, whispering fears into her ear. She imagined it as a heavy cloak, constantly threatening to slip and reveal the raw, vulnerable skin beneath. Lady Clara looked up, her brow furrowed with childish concern. "Do you have a secret sadness, Miss Vance?" Eleanor's breath caught, a tiny, involuntary hitch in her chest. She forced her smile to widen, to appear more convincing. "No, my dear Clara, not a sadness. Just a quiet contentment in our lessons, and in watching you grow so clever." The lie tasted bland on her tongue, but it was a necessary one. This quiet corner of Blackwood Manor, with its towering shelves of forgotten volumes and the gentle rhythm of Clara's learning, was her refuge. It was a haven built on silence and meticulous anonymity, and she would guard it with every fiber of her being. But the past was a tenacious hunter. It clung to the edges of her dreams, appearing in fleeting fragmented images. A grand ballroom, the scent of exotic flowers, the feel of silk against her fingertips. A sudden intense gaze from across a crowded room, a pair of piercing blue eyes that had burned into her memory, even after so long. She often wondered if those eyes had forgotten her, or if they too carried a fragment of that chance encounter. Far away at the imposing Thorne estate, Duke Alaric Thorne stood before a vast oak desk, his gaze fixed on a collection of old sketches. The air in his study was cool, carrying the scent of aged leather and pipe tobacco, and the only sound was the crackle of logs in the cavernous fireplace. His fingers, strong and unyielding, smoothed the edge of a particular drawing. It was a simple sketch, hastily rendered, of a woman caught in a moment of surprise, her long dark hair slightly disheveled, her gray eyes ardent and luminous. It was not a portrait, it was an impression, a memory captured on paper. 2 years, 2 long years since he had seen her, 2 years since that brief, fleeting encounter had imprinted itself upon his soul, sparking an obsession that refused to wane. He had searched diligently, relentlessly, employing every resource at his disposal. His agents had scoured every corner of the capital, every provincial town, following whispers and shadows, yet she remained elusive, a ghost. He felt an inexplicable pull, a deep conviction that she was not merely a memory, but a presence he was destined to find. Alaric traced the curve of the sketched jawline with his thumb. Her face was not conventionally beautiful in the way society admired, yet it possessed a rare, arresting quality. It was her eyes, he thought, that held the true power. They spoke of a depth he had only glimpsed, a hidden world of feeling that had captivated him in that single, unforgettable moment. He recalled the light in them, a sudden spark that had ignited something profound within him. His search had become a solitary burden, a quiet madness that consumed his waking hours and haunted his dreams. People called him obsessive, perhaps even mad, for pursuing a woman whose name he did not know, whose history was a complete blank. But Alaric knew. He knew that the connection he felt was real, powerful, and undeniable. He ran his hand through his dark, neatly combed hair, a gesture of weary determination. He would not give up. He could not. Back at Blackwood Manor, the tranquility of the afternoon was shattered by a flurry of activity. A liveried footman, his usually impassive face alight with barely contained excitement, carried an ornate envelope into the drawing room. The heavy parchment bore the distinctive, elaborate crest of the Beaumont family, host of the annual ball. The invitation was not a surprise. It was an institution, a yearly highlight of the social calendar. Yet this year it brought with it a different kind of tremor, a ripple of both anticipation and unease. Mrs. Higgins, the formidable housekeeper, bustled into the schoolroom, her voice unusually bright. "Miss Vance, Lady Clara, the invitations have arrived for the Beaumont ball." She paused, her eyes twinkling, imagining the splendor. "It promises to be a most grand affair this year. All the finest families, they say." Clara clapped her hands, her small face radiating pure joy. "Oh, Miss Vance, may I stay up late? Will there be dancing? Can I wear my blue silk gown?" Her questions tumbled out in a rapid, excited rush, her imagination already conjuring images of glittering lights and swirling skirts. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The ball. The one event each year she dreaded more than any other. It was a necessary evil, a gathering of the very society she worked so hard to avoid, a dangerous kaleidoscope of faces, voices, and memories. A ball was a public stage, a place where anonymity was a luxury no one could afford. Her carefully constructed walls, so sturdy in the quiet seclusion of the manor, felt suddenly fragile, vulnerable to the crushing pressure of hundreds of curious eyes. "We shall see, Clara," Eleanor murmured, her voice carefully neutral, masking the rising tide of panic within her. "There will certainly be dancing, and I am sure you will look beautiful in any gown you choose." She forced herself to smile again, though her lips felt stiff, stretched tight across her teeth. The scent of wood smoke, usually comforting, now seemed acrid, sharp in her nostrils, making her feel suddenly breathless. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest at the thought of attending. The thought of stepping back into that gilded world, even as a mere shadow, filled her with a profound sense of dread. It was like walking into a lion's den, hoping the beast would not notice the scent of fear on her skin. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let one careless moment shatter her carefully constructed peace. She pictured the grand ballroom, the countless faces, the endless possibilities for disaster. Later that evening, after Clara was tucked into bed, dreaming of silk and dancing, Eleanor stood by her small, unadorned window, gazing out at the moonlit grounds of Blackwood Manor. The night was still, save for the whisper of the wind through the ancient trees. A shiver unrelated to the cool night air ran down her spine. The ball. It was not just the general fear of exposure that gripped her, it was a specific gnawing anxiety. The memory of those piercing blue eyes, the Duke's eyes, suddenly felt more vivid than ever before, as if the approaching event had somehow conjured him from the depths of her subconscious. She had pushed that memory deep down, buried it beneath layers of practicality and self-preservation. But tonight it surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. What if he was there? What if he recognized her despite the passage of time, despite her changed circumstances, her altered demeanor? The thought made her heart pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. She was no longer the woman he had briefly encountered, the woman of society, adorned in silks and jewels. She was Eleanor Vance, governess, a ghost of her former self, and she had to remain that way. Her hand, almost unconsciously, reached beneath the neckline of her simple nightgown. Her fingers closed around the familiar, cool metal of the silver locket that lay hidden against her skin. It was tarnished now, its once bright surface dulled by time and wear, but its weight was a constant, comforting presence. The faint, almost faded crest engraved on its side was barely discernible, a secret symbol of a life that was both cherished and violently torn away. It was a tangible link to a world she had lost, a memory she carried close, yet dared not reveal. Eleanor squeezed the locket tightly, the small piece of metal digging into her flesh, a sharp, grounding sensation. The upcoming ball felt like a precipice, a gaping chasm threatening to swallow her whole. The anonymity she had so painstakingly built, her fragile peace, everything she now held dear, felt terrifyingly precarious. She knew with a chilling certainty that the ball held the power to either solidify her escape or to utterly shatter the carefully constructed anonymity of her life. The silver locket, cool against Eleanor's skin, offered little comfort. Each tick of the clock in the manor's great hall echoed the rising anxiety in her chest, counting down the hours until the Beaumont ball. She stood by the tall, arched window, watching the last sliver of twilight fade from the sky, painting the manicured gardens in shades of deep indigo. The air outside held the crisp scent of autumn leaves and damp earth, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth of the drawing room. She considered every polite phrase, every plausible excuse to avoid the suffocating press of nobility that would soon fill the ballroom room. Perhaps a sudden convenient headache? A lingering cough? Her mind raced, desperate for a reason that would be accepted without question, one that would allow her to remain safely hidden within the quiet sanctuary of her small room. The thought of facing scores of unfamiliar eyes, each a potential gateway to her past, sent a shiver through her. She hugged herself, trying to still the tremble in her hands, her fingers still unconsciously pressed against the hidden locket. The low hum of servants preparing for the grand event drifted through the corridors, a constant reminder of the inescapable reality. Even the normally placid Lady Clara seemed caught in the whirlwind of excitement, her bright blue eyes sparkling with anticipation. Eleanor had spent the afternoon answering a barrage of questions about silks and laces, jewels and dances, each innocent query a fresh twist of the knife in her carefully guarded composure. She had offered a strained smile, her voice calm and even, while inside a storm raged. A soft knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her dark reverie. Lady Beaumont entered, her silk gown rustling gently, a serene smile gracing her lips. The air around Lady Beaumont always carried a faint scent of lavender and rosewater, a comforting presence for many. But for Eleanor, it now felt like a gentle, silken noose tightening around her. Eleanor turned, curtsying deeply, her heart giving a nervous flutter. "Eleanor, my dear," Lady Beaumont began, her voice smooth and kind. "I trust you are ready for the evening's festivities?" Eleanor swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Lady Beaumont," she replied, her voice carefully modulated, "I confess I was hoping to beg your indulgence. Lady Clara is quite capable of attending the ball with her governess, but perhaps I could assist with the younger children who will not be present." She offered a hopeful glance, trying to infuse her words with genuine concern for the other children, hoping to make her absence seem a selfless act rather than a desperate retreat. She watched Lady Beaumont's face, searching for any sign of acceptance, any flicker of understanding in her kind eyes. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant murmur of the household. Lady Beaumont's smile softened further, a knowing warmth in her gaze that made Eleanor's carefully constructed composure feel fragile, almost transparent. "That is thoughtful of you, Eleanor," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. "However, Clara has spoken of little else all week but having you by her side tonight. She is so looking forward to sharing the evening's delights with you." Eleanor's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. She knew the request was not merely for companionship. Lady Beaumont relied on her quiet guidance, her steady presence to keep Lady Clara poised and proper amidst the boisterous energy of a noble gathering. Her role was not simply a companion, but a guardian of decorum, a silent sentinel against youthful indiscretions. The thought of being in the heart of such a crowd, under the scrutiny of countless eyes, felt like a public execution. "Besides," Lady Beaumont continued, her tone lightly chiding, "a little diversion would do you good. You work so diligently, my dear. A night of music and cheerful company is precisely what one needs occasionally." She paused, her gaze resting on Eleanor's tired features. "Your presence, of course, is required. Clara will not be dissuaded, and quite frankly, neither am I." A hint of playful authority entered her voice, leaving no room for further argument. Eleanor merely inclined her head, a strained smile touching her lips. "Of course, Lady Beaumont," she murmured, the words tasting like ash in Hert's mouth. I shall make myself ready. She felt a wave of resignation wash over her, a bitter current pulling her under. The battle was lost before it had truly begun. The scent of lavender now felt stifling, trapping her in a gilded cage. Across the vast rolling hills and sprawling estates, within the formidable stone walls of Thorn Estate, Duke Alaric Thorn found himself in an unfamiliar state of restless anticipation. He sat in his cavernous study, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows across the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air, usually a comforting embrace, but tonight it felt strangely suffocating. He held a glass of amber liquid, swirling it slowly, but did not drink. The invitation to the Beaumont Ball lay on his mahogany desk, a stark white contrast against the dark wood. He had glanced at it days ago, dismissed it with his usual disdain for such gatherings, and then found himself drawn to it again and again. Balls were tedious affairs, a parade of simpering debutantes and posturing gentlemen, all vying for attention or advantageous alliances. He preferred the quiet solitude of his books, the challenge of his estate's management, the cold logic of numbers and ledgers. Yet something about this particular invitation tugged at him, a faint but persistent whisper in his mind. He closed his eyes, leaning back in his high-backed leather chair. For 2 years, an image had haunted him, a fleeting glimpse of a woman with intelligent gray eyes, a defiant tilt to her chin, and a grace that had captured his imagination completely. He had seen her only once, briefly, amidst the chaos of a society scandal, and then she had vanished as if she were merely a dream. He had searched, relentlessly, discreetly, employing every resource at his disposal, but she had melted into the ether. His men had returned with nothing but dead ends, empty reports, and frustrating denials. He had pored over every detail of that brief encounter, every inflection of her voice, every subtle movement of her hands, trying to etch her into his memory, hoping some forgotten detail would surface and lead him to her. The memory had faded with time, becoming more a feeling than a precise image, yet the longing remained. He sometimes wondered if he had conjured her from the depths of his own desires, a phantom of his lonely heart. But tonight a new sensation stirred within him, a strange, almost physical pull towards Blackwood Manor. It was not a logical thought, not a deduction based on evidence, but a primal instinct, a deep thrumming in his very bones. He felt it in the subtle clench of his jaw, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands, the prickle on the back of his neck. It was as if destiny itself were calling him, whispering promises of an answer he had long sought. He rose from his chair, his tall frame uncoiling with a deliberate grace. He walked to the vast window, gazing out at the moonless night, the distant lights of the village mere pinpricks in the blackness. He could almost feel the presence of the woman he sought, a phantom thread drawing him across the miles. It was foolish, irrational, yet he could not dismiss the feeling. The anticipation was a curious thing, a mix of excitement and unease, a sensation he rarely experienced. He made a decision then, one driven by an inexplicable hunch rather than cold reason. He would go. Back at Blackwood Manor, Eleanor found herself standing before her meager wardrobe, a collection of practical, unassuming garments designed for a life of quiet servitude. Her fingers brushed against the rough linen, the faded cotton, the modest wool. There were no silks, no satins, no intricate laces here. Her past life, filled with vibrant colors and luxurious fabrics, felt like a distant, half-forgotten dream. A faint scent of mothballs clung to the heavier items, a reminder of their long storage. She reached for the simplest gown she possessed, a dress of dove gray silk, its color designed to recede into the background, its cut utterly plain. It was the best she had, a relic from an earlier time, altered and re-altered to fit her current circumstances. It had once been a respectable, if modest, evening dress, suitable for a young lady of lesser nobility attending a quiet social gathering. Now it was merely functional, a uniform of anonymity. She held the fabric to her cheek, feeling the soft, smooth texture, a fleeting moment of comfort in its familiarity. This dress was her armor, her camouflage. She would blend into the tapestry of the ball, a forgotten thread, an unnoticed shadow. No one would look twice at her. No one would remember her. This was her only defense against the ghosts of her past, against the possibility of being seen. As she dressed, her reflection in the small, tarnished mirror showed a woman whose delicate features were often worn by hardship, yet still possessed an inherent, quiet beauty. Her long, dark hair, usually tied back simply for practicality, was now coiled into a modest chignon, a few soft tendrils escaping to frame her face. Her gray eyes, often betraying her inner turmoil, were carefully composed, though a deep weariness lingered in their depths. She applied a touch of rosewater to her wrists, the faint scent a futile attempt to mask the scent of fear that clung to her. She looked at the locket, still nestled against her skin, concealed beneath the simple silk. It was her only tangible link to the life she had lost, a cherished memento from a loved one she could never forget. Her fingers traced the faded engraving, a silent prayer escaping her lips, a plea for continued anonymity, for the strength to survive the coming hours unscathed. The mirror showed her a stranger, a governess named Eleanor Vance, a woman crafted from necessity and fear. The girl she once was, vibrant and full of hope, had long since been buried beneath layers of carefully constructed pretense. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She could do this. She had to. Lady Clara depended on her, and her continued survival depended on her ability to remain invisible. The sounds of the ball now reached her ears, a muted symphony of violins, laughter, and the gentle clinking of glasses. The manor, usually so quiet after Lady Clara's bedtime, was alive with a vibrant energy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She could almost taste the champagne, feel the press of bodies, hear the murmur of 100 conversations. Each step she took towards the ballroom felt like an irreversible descent into an abyss. She guided Lady Clara through the bustling corridors, her young charge radiating an innocent excitement that Eleanor found both endearing and agonizing. Lady Clara, in her pale blue gown and silver slippers, looked like a tiny, perfect fairy, completely unaware of the heavy cloak of dread her governess wore. Eleanor forced a smile, her hand gently resting on Lady Clara's small back, guiding her through the throng of eager guests. The air grew warmer, thicker with the mingling scents of expensive perfumes, beeswax, and celebratory food. The music swelled, a lively waltz that seemed to pull at Eleanor's very soul, reminding her of a time when she, too, had danced without a care, without a hidden identity to protect. She could feel the vibrations of the music through the soles of her thin slippers, each note a step closer to her own potential undoing. Then they reached the threshold. The ballroom doors stood wide open, a dazzling portal to a world she both yearned for and feared. Light, bright and golden, streamed from countless crystal chandeliers, glinting off polished marble floors and jeweled gowns. The sheer volume of sound, the cacophony of voices and music, washed over her in a dizzying wave. Faces, a blur of smiles and polite expressions, moved within the grand space, a sea of potential recognition. Eleanor stepped inside, the warm air of the ballroom enveloping her, carrying with it the scent of fresh flowers and human ambition. Her heart, a frightened bird, began to pound against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the waltz music. She felt a profound fear, a cold dread that tightened her chest and threatened to steal her breath. Yet, beneath the terror, a strange, unwelcome flicker of hope ignited deep within her, a dangerous ember in the vast darkness of her fear. It was a dangerous, fleeting thought that perhaps, just perhaps, for one night, she could simply be. The grand ballroom at Blackwood Manor pulsed with 1,000 tiny heartbeats, each one a whisper of laughter, a rustle of silk, a clink of crystal. Eleanor stepped into the dazzling expanse, her own heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the bright light a physical assault after the hushed corridors. The air hung heavy with the scent of lilies and expensive perfumes, a dizzying mix that tightened her throat. Lady Clara's small hand, warm and trusting, remained clasped in hers, a fragile anchor in a swirling sea of strangers. Eleanor's gaze swept the room with an almost desperate efficiency, a practiced dance of scanning and dismissing. She sought the periphery, the protective shadows where she could merge into the backdrop, unseen and unheard. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any familiar curve of a smile that might unravel her carefully constructed anonymity. Each passing moment was a tightening knot in her chest, a silent plea for invisibility in a room designed for display. Clara, oblivious to the storm brewing within her governess, gasped softly, her bright blue eyes wide with innocent wonder. "Oh, look, Miss Vance. The dancers spin like enchanted tops." Eleanor forced a faint smile, her voice a low, steady murmur. "Indeed, Lady Clara. They move with such grace." She tightened her grip on the child's hand, guiding them towards a quieter alcove by a towering window, where a plush velvet settee offered a semblance of refuge. From here, she could observe the room without drawing undue attention, or so she desperately hoped. The heavy velvet curtains, draped richly, felt like a silent ally. A violin soared, then dipped into a melancholic waltz, its notes weaving through the chatter, a stark contrast to the cacophony in Eleanor's mind. She watched the couples twirl, their elaborate gowns blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors, their faces alight with carefree enjoyment. This world, once her own, now felt foreign, a dangerous masquerade she was ill-equipped to join. The chill of the polished marble floor seeped through her thin slippers, a cold reminder of her precarious position. Every rustle of a gown, every raised voice, every sudden turn of a head sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She was a phantom, a whisper of a woman. Yet in this room filled with memories and potential threats, she felt starkly, terrifyingly real. Her past was a silent, hungry beast, forever lurking, waiting for the opportune moment to spring forth and devour her fragile present. The silver locket, a cold, forgotten weight beneath her dress, felt like both a comfort and a curse. "Miss Vance, may I have a lemon tart?" Clara's voice, a bright chime, broke through Eleanor's frantic thoughts. "Of course, my dear." Eleanor's breath hitched, forcing herself to appear calm, to offer a reassuring smile. She would find one, even if it meant venturing closer to the heart of the ballroom, a risk she was loath to take. She smoothed Clara's golden curls, a small maternal gesture that grounded her. The child's simple request was a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink of pure terror. She kept Clara close, her body a subtle shield, as they navigated the edges of the throng. The scent of roasted meats and sweet pastries mingled with the floral perfumes, a rich tapestry of aromas that only heightened her sense of disorientation. Her eyes continued their frantic dance, scanning each newcomer, each face turning towards the entrance. It was an involuntary act, a survival instinct honed over 2 long, solitary years. Then a sudden, almost imperceptible shift rippled through the grand room. A hush fell, a momentary pause in the joyous din, as if the very air had thickened. Heads began to turn, a slow, deliberate movement drawing gazes towards the ornate double doors. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, a cold premonition snaking down her spine. Her heart began to pound with a frantic, desperate rhythm, a silent alarm bell ringing in her ears. Duke Alaric Thorne entered the ballroom. His presence was a physical force, an almost tangible weight that settled upon the room. He was a stark, imposing figure, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his dark evening coat a somber contrast to the vibrant colors swirling around him. A collective murmur, barely audible but deeply felt, spread through the assembled nobility. His dark, neatly combed hair caught the light from the chandeliers, his sharp features cast in a brief, almost forbidding shadow. He moved with an effortless authority, his stride purposeful, his piercing blue eyes sweeping the room with a practiced, almost predatory intensity. Eleanor felt a jolt, a lightning strike through her very core. Her vision narrowed, everything else in the ballroom blurring into an indistinct haze. All focus drawn inexorably to him. It was him, the man from 2 years ago, the one whose gaze had lingered just a moment too long, whose quiet words had echoed in her memory long after their fleeting encounter. The man who had been a dangerous, intoxicating whisper in her carefully guarded dreams. He paused just inside the entrance, his eyes moving with a methodical precision, a silent, relentless search. There was an unspoken hunger in his gaze, a deep-seated determination that was both terrifying and utterly captivating. His presence commanded attention, silencing the frivolous chatter, drawing every eye, including hers. A wave of profound shock washed over Eleanor, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt suddenly small, utterly exposed, as if the walls of the grand ballroom had dissolved, leaving her standing naked before his formidable presence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped within a cage, threatening to burst free. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin cold and clammy, a stark contrast to the sudden burning flush that crept up her neck. His eyes, those impossibly blue, intelligent eyes, continued their slow, deliberate arc across the room. He was searching, she knew it. But for what? For whom? The thought, though terrifying, brought a strange, unwelcome flicker of a long-buried hope, a dangerous emotion she had long since learned to extinguish. He could not be searching for her. She was a ghost, a memory erased. But then his gaze paused. It stopped. Not on her, not yet, but in her general direction, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than on any other face. It was enough. Enough to send a fresh wave of ice through her veins, freezing her in place. She felt a profound, visceral certainty, an unshakable knowing that her carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The very air around her seemed to crackle with an unbearable tension. The memory of their brief encounter 2 years prior flooded her mind with vivid, excruciating detail. The quiet gardens, the unexpected turn, the way his eyes had met hers across the dew-kissed lawns, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them, a silent language that had stirred something deep within her, something she had instantly stifled, knowing it could only lead to ruin. His words, a simple, polite inquiry, had felt like a brand upon her soul, searing into her consciousness. She remembered the warmth of his gaze, the quiet strength in his bearing, the brief moment when she had felt truly seen before she had forced herself to flee. Now he was here, real, tangible, and his gaze was drawing closer, closer, like a magnet pulled to steel. Her breath hitched again, a sharp, ragged intake of air. She instinctively pressed herself closer to Clara, her small frame a desperate shield against the inevitable. Her mind raced, a frantic torrent of questions and impossible solutions. What would she do? How could she deny him? How could she escape the fate she had so meticulously avoided for so long? The sheer scale of his power, his influence, was an insurmountable wall towering over her fragile defenses. She tried to compose herself, to summon the iron will that had carried her through so many trials. Her face, she hoped, remained a neutral mask, revealing none of the turmoil raging within her. Her hands, however, trembled slightly, betraying the icy grip of fear that now held her captive. She focused on Clara's small, innocent face, on the gentle rise and fall of her chest, a desperate plea for normalcy in a moment of terrifying upheaval. And then, it happened. His piercing blue eyes, still sweeping the room with that unwavering intensity, landed directly upon her. It was a searing, undeniable connection, a collision of gazes across the crowded expanse of dancers and conversing nobles. For Eleanor, the world tilted on its axis. The vibrant colors of the ballroom faded to gray, the joyous music dissolved into a distant hum. All that remained was him, his eyes, and the terrifying, absolute certainty of recognition. A gasp caught in her throat, a small choke sound that no one else could hear. Her heart gave a violent lurch, then seemed to stop altogether, suspended in a moment of pure, unadulterated dread. Every nerve ending in her body screamed, a silent siren of alarm. He saw her. He truly saw her. There was no mistaking the sudden, subtle shift in his expression, the way his eyes, which had been methodically scanning, now sharpened, fixed, and held. It was a fleeting moment, an eternity compressed into a single breath. For Eleanor, it was an instant of profound shock and instant recognition, a devastating blow to her carefully constructed illusion of safety. His face, etched in her memory like a phantom limb, was now vividly, terrifyingly real. The memory of his voice, deep and resonant, echoed in her ears, though he had uttered not a single word. His presence alone was enough to unravel her. He was still several yards away, an impassable chasm of people separating them. Yet his gaze felt like a physical touch, burning into her skin, scorching away the layers of pretense she had so painstakingly built. She felt utterly naked, exposed to the scrutiny of the one man she had most desperately hoped to avoid, the one man whose memory had haunted her quiet, solitary nights. Her carefully cultivated composure crumbled, threatening to shatter into a million pieces. The fear was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that wrapped around her, stealing her breath. She had been found. After 2 years of hiding, of living a life shrouded in secrecy, the relentless hunter had finally cornered his prey. The game, she knew with chilling certainty, was over. Her future, her very existence, hung by a single fragile thread. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and a strange, unwelcome flicker of despair, locked onto his. She searched his face for any sign of knowing, any indication that he remembered her specifically. Not just a passing face in the crowd, but his expression, while intense, remained unreadable, a formidable mask that offered no solace, no hint of his thoughts. It was a gaze of profound intensity, a curious, almost hungry stare, but whether it was recognition or mere fascination, she could not tell. The ambiguity was almost worse than certainty. The blood roared in her ears, drowning out the music, the laughter, the chatter. Her vision swam, the ornate ballroom spinning around her. She felt a dizzying sense of unreality, as if this moment were a nightmare from which she desperately needed to awaken. But Clara's small hand remained firmly in hers, a warm, undeniable tether to reality. She could not collapse. She could not break. Not yet. Not while Clara was here. With a superhuman effort of will, Eleanor tore her gaze away from his. It was a violent wrench, a painful act of severing a connection that had lasted only a second, yet felt like an eternity. Her head snapped away, her eyes darting frantically, desperately seeking an escape, a place to hide, to simply disappear. The air tasted metallic, a tangible manifestation of her panic. Her hand, without conscious thought, without any instruction from her reeling mind, flew instinctively to the silver locket hidden beneath her gown. Her fingers locked around the cold, tarnished metal, pressing it tightly against the frantic beat of her heart. It was a desperate, unconscious plea for protection, a silent prayer to the only tangible link she had left to her lost past, a past she had so meticulously buried. She was unaware that Alaric's intense stare, though she had averted her own, had already locked onto her, a silent, predatory focus on that small, telling gesture. A flicker of light from the crystal chandeliers caught on the small, silver locket as her hands settled against her chest. It was a movement so slight, so unconscious, yet to Duke Alaric Thorne, it was like a sudden, sharp intake of breath. He had been sweeping the room with his usual methodical intensity, observing the woman who had averted her gaze so abruptly. Her profile, the way she held her head, the dark hair escaping a simple pin, all had pricked at a distant corner of his mind. But the gesture, that fleeting touch to the hidden locket, unlocked something far more profound. 2 years. 2 years of sketches, of whispered inquiries, of fruitless searches across the continent. He had chased a ghost, a vision that had burned itself into his memory during a single bewildering encounter. It had been at a dusty country inn, far from the grand ballrooms he now frequented. A woman, cloaked and hooded, had sought refuge from a sudden storm. Her face had been partially obscured, her voice low, but her eyes, those striking gray eyes, had held a depth of sorrow he had never forgotten. And then, as she spoke, her hand had gone to her chest, a small silver glint beneath her cloak, a protective, almost vulnerable gesture. He remembered the way the inn's rough firelight had glinted off the tarnished metal. He remembered the quiet tremor in her hand, the way her fingers had almost caressed the object. He remembered the feeling of being utterly captivated by the mystery she presented, a fleeting presence in a world of rigid order. He had offered assistance then, a carriage to her destination, but she had politely, firmly declined, disappearing into the night as swiftly as she had arrived. He had never even learned her name. Now, watching her across the vibrant ballroom, the memory surged with an almost physical force, knocking the air from his lungs. The slight bend of her wrist, the delicate curve of her fingers, the very intent behind the movement. It was identical. It was her. The woman from the inn, the woman who had haunted his thoughts, who had driven his relentless search, was standing before him, disguised as a mere governess. A cold certainty settled deep in his bones, absolute and unyielding. The very air around him seemed to thicken, the distant music fading into a dull hum as his focus narrowed entirely upon her. Every other face, every other sound in the opulent room simply ceased to exist. Eleanor felt the weight of his stare, not just a glance now, but a concentrated, unwavering pressure that pinned her in place. It was a cold hand reaching into her chest, squeezing her heart until it ached. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat, refusing to move. She knew. She knew with a horrifying, gut-wrenching certainty that the carefully constructed wall she had built around herself had just crumbled to dust. His intense blue eyes, now fixed upon her, held a depth of recognition that stole all the color from the glittering ballroom. A tremor ran through her, starting in her fingertips and spreading rapidly through her limbs. Her hands, which had been resting demurely at her sides, now felt clammy and foreign. The silk of her plain gown suddenly seemed to itch, pressing in on her, suffocating her. She felt exposed, stripped bare beneath his gaze, every secret, every painful truth laid open. The murmurs of conversation, the cheerful lilt of the waltz, all transformed into a mocking symphony of her impending doom. She wanted to run, to push through the throng of laughing faces, to find a dark corner where she could disappear forever. But her feet felt rooted to the polished marble floor. Her mind screamed at her to move, to speak, to do something. But her body remained frozen, a statue caught in the spotlight of his terrifying attention. Lady Clara, blissfully unaware, tugged gently at her sleeve, asking about the elaborate ice sculpture in the corner. Eleanor could only offer a weak, tremulous smile, her eyes still locked in a silent, desperate plea with Alaric's unyielding stare. He moved. The realization hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. He shifted his weight, his broad shoulders cutting through the air with an almost predatory grace. His gaze never left her, a dark, unwavering beacon in the swirling sea of dancers. The music, which had seemed so distant moments before, now throbbed with a terrifying rhythm, mirroring the frantic beat of her own heart. She saw the set of his jewel, the determined glint in his eyes, and knew there was no escaping him now. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. This was it. 2 years of careful anonymity, of living a quiet, unassuming life, of meticulously guarding her past. All of it was about to unravel. She had imagined this moment in her darkest nightmares, but even in those dreams, the dread had never felt this absolute, this crushing. Her fingers locked around the silver locket beneath her dress, the cool metal a small, futile anchor against the rising tide of fear. Alaric began his deliberate journey across the ballroom. He was a force of nature, cutting a path through the glittering throng. The air around him seemed to part, nobles and ladies instinctively stepping aside, their conversations faltering for a moment as he passed. He did not notice their curious glances, their murmurs of speculation. His entire being was focused on the woman at the edge of the room. Every step was measured, purposeful, a silent declaration of his unwavering intent. He saw the fear bloom in her eyes, a fleeting, desperate flicker that only intensified his resolve. She was trying to blend, to be invisible, but to him she stood out like a single precious jewel amidst a collection of polished stones. The subtle scent of her, perhaps lavender or a faint, sweet rose, seemed to drift across the distance, calling to him. He felt an almost visceral pull, a magnetic force that had guided him for 2 years without his conscious knowledge, now fully realized and overwhelming. He remembered her story, whispered in hushed tones around the inn fire. A journey, a loss, a profound need for solitude. He had respected it then, letting her go, believing she would simply reappear. Now he understood the depth of her retreat, the carefully constructed facade, and now he would uncover every layer. He had finally found her. The thought thrummed through him, a powerful, possessive beat beneath his calm exterior. Eleanor watched him approach, each step a hammer blow against her fragile composure. The distance between them was shrinking with agonizing slowness. She could distinguish the details of his face now, the sharp line of his nose, the firm set of his mouth, the intense, almost hungry look in his eyes. He was not merely approaching, he was hunting, and she was his prey. Her skin prickled with 1,000 tiny needles, a sensation of dread that made her want to claw at her own flesh. Lady Clara, sensing Eleanor's sudden stillness, looked up at her governess with wide, questioning eyes. "Are you quite all right, Miss Vance?" she asked, her voice a small, innocent bell in the vast room. Eleanor forced herself to look down at the child, to offer another strained smile, a desperate attempt to appear normal, to appear unseen. But her gaze kept darting back to Alaric, now just a handful of yards away, his presence eclipsing all others. The music swelled, a grand, sweeping melody that felt entirely out of place with the terror gripping Eleanor. She could feel the heat radiating from his formidable frame even across the remaining short distance. Her throat felt parched, her tongue thick and useless. The hum of conversations became a roaring in her ears, making it impossible to focus, impossible to think clearly. Her world, once so carefully ordered and controlled, was now spinning wildly, threatening to consume her. She had to do something. Anything. Deny him, lie, feign ignorance. It felt futile. The recognition in his eyes was too absolute. Her mind raced, a frantic squirrel caught in a trap. Could she plead illness? Could she claim a sudden urgent matter? The excuses formed in her mind, only to dissolve into meaningless fragments. He would not be deterred. Not after 2 years of searching. Not after seeing that gesture. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel the tremor in her hands, the cold sweat beating on her brow despite the warmth of the room. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but where could she go? The ballroom was an open cage, and he was the keeper. She imagined the whispers, the scandal, the ruin of Lady Clara's reputation if her past were to be exposed here. Now. The thought solidified her resolve not to escape, but to defend. Her eyes darted around, searching for an ally, a distraction, anything. She saw Lady Beaumont laughing with a group of friends, Lord Beaumont deep in conversation. No help there. Lady Clara was still looking at her, a worried frown on her young face. Eleanor could not drag the child into this. She was alone, utterly, terribly alone. Alaric was almost upon her. She could practically feel the warmth of his presence, the intensity of his gaze burning into her. His shadow seemed to fall over her, engulfing her in its formidable darkness. Her carefully constructed anonymity, her fragile peace, everything was about to be torn asunder. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, desperate sound swallowed by the ballroom's din. She knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. The plan, whatever it might be, had to surface now, before his voice broke the silence between them and shattered her world irrevocably. As Alaric closed the distance, Eleanor's mind raced, desperately trying to formulate a plan, any plan, to escape his notice and preserve her secret. The vibrant swell of music seemed to dim to a distant hum. Eleanor felt a shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable pressure, before she even saw him. The scent of polished leather and a faint masculine spice reached her, cutting through the cloying sweetness of the ballroom's floral arrangements. Her breath caught in her throat, a small, sharp sound that only she could hear over the rising cacophony of her own heartbeat. She knew this smell. She knew the presence it heralded. A shadow fell over her, taller and broader than the others around them. She did not need to lift her gaze to confirm her fear. The world seemed to narrow to the small space between them, an island of tense silence in the swirling currents of laughter and conversation. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to disappear into the tapestry-lined walls, to become invisible. But her feet felt rooted to the floorboards, heavy and unwilling to obey. She felt the warmth radiating from him, an oppressive heat that promised danger and exposure. Then, his voice, deep and resonant, it cut through the festive din, a clear, authoritative sound that demanded attention. It was the voice that had haunted her dreams for 2 years, the voice of the man who had looked at her with an intensity that promised both ruin and a strange, terrifying salvation. "Have we met before, madam? Your face seems familiar." The words hung in the air, a silken trap. Eleanor finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his with a practiced, icy composure that belied the tempest raging within her. His eyes, a startling blue, were like two piercing probes dissecting her, searching for the truth she desperately buried. They held a glint of recognition, a flicker of something she had seen before, something predatory and unnervingly certain. The memory of his touch, brief and electric, on her hand 2 years ago, surged through her, threatening to unravel her carefully constructed facade. She could almost feel the phantom warmth of his fingers against hers, a ghost of a connection that now threatened to destroy her. A tremor ran through her, subtle and quickly suppressed. Her fingers locked around the delicate porcelain of her teacup, the warmth of the ceramic a small anchor in her suddenly spinning world. If she let go, she knew she would spill it, a clumsy accident that would betray her true state. The polished floor beneath her seemed to sway. She tasted copper in her mouth, the sharp tang of fear. The distant music now felt like a taunt, a cruel accompaniment to her imminent downfall. She drew a shallow breath, forcing her voice to remain steady, formal, and utterly devoid of emotion. Her chin lifted fractionally, a gesture of polite, aloof indifference. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in the quiet solitude of her room, preparing for an encounter she hoped would never come. Every word was carefully chosen, every inflection meticulously controlled. "I believe not, Your Grace. I am merely Lady Clara's governess." The lie felt like ash on her tongue, yet she spoke it with an ease that even surprised herself. She watched for a reaction, a flicker of disbelief, a hint of suspicion that would tell her she had failed. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of aristocratic decorum, but his eyes narrowed, just perceptibly. They searched hers, probing for any crack in her carefully built wall. She met his gaze, her own gray eyes unwavering, though inside she felt like a fragile glass about to shatter. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. She felt the weight of his scrutiny, a physical burden that pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe naturally. The scent of his presence intensified, a rich, earthy fragrance that was uniquely his, stirring a forgotten ache deep within her. He did not move, did not speak again immediately, simply observed her with an unnerving stillness. She could hear the rustle of silk as dancers moved past, the clinking of glasses, the hum of polite chatter, all forming a muffled background to the silent battle unfolding between them. She forced herself to remember her purpose, her precarious position, the absolute necessity of maintaining her secret. Lady Clara's innocent face flashed in her mind, a powerful shield against the Duke's piercing gaze. She was a governess, a quiet, unremarkable woman, an employee. Nothing more. She had to believe it, even if he did not. Alaric's lips thinned almost imperceptibly. He possessed a keen eye for detail, a mind trained to dissect and analyze, and her composure was almost too perfect. He noticed the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her grip tightened on the teacup, a tiny tell that spoke volumes to his discerning gaze. Her voice, though steady, carried a faint, almost imperceptible coolness, a deliberate distance that did not quite ring true. He had expected surprise, perhaps even a hint of fear, but not this carefully constructed indifference. He stepped a fraction closer, his presence expanding, threatening to overwhelm her. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it felt like a tidal wave crashing against her carefully constructed walls. He wanted to see if she would flinch, if her breath would catch, if any part of her carefully maintained facade would crumble under the subtle pressure. He saw only a subtle clenching of her jaw, a stubborn defiance that only solidified his suspicion. Her denial was almost flawless, a masterpiece of quiet disengagement, yet his gut screamed at him. It was her, the same delicate features, a little more worn by what he could only imagine had been hardship, but unmistakably the woman who had captivated him 2 years ago. The memory of the silver locket, the way her hand had flown to her chest, was branded into his mind. He knew it. He simply knew. He took another slow breath, the scent of her, subtle and clean, filling his senses. It was not a grand perfume, but a quiet, almost domestic scent that somehow resonated with the memory of their brief, intense encounter. The scent of her hair, perhaps, or the fabric of her simple gown. It was a detail, a thread he could tug on, but not here, not now. He felt a strange mix of frustration and exhilarating triumph. She was here, finally, and she was denying him. It was a challenge, a game he was more than willing to play. He saw the flash of something in her gray eyes, a fleeting moment of fierce independence and deep-seated pain, before she veiled it again. It was enough. Eleanor felt a cold bead of sweat trace a path down her spine. His silence was more terrifying than any accusation. It was the silence of a man who observed, who analyzed, who waited. The polite smiles of the other guests around them, the gentle sway of the dancers, seemed like a mockery of her internal torment. She needed to escape, to breathe, to think. She needed to put distance between herself and the Duke before her carefully constructed reality completely dissolved. She glanced swiftly around, her eyes darting through the crowd, seeking a familiar childlike form. Lady Clara, her charge, her excuse, there by the refreshment table, innocently reaching for a small pastry, a lifeline. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice now edged with a carefully manufactured concern. "Lady Clara requires my attention. It would not do for her to consume too many sweets before the main supper." She offered a small, curt curtsy, not waiting for his reply, her movements swift and decisive. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She turned on her heel, her gaze fixed on Lady Clara, and began to weave her way through the throng of elegant ladies and distinguished gentlemen. Each step was an act of will, a desperate attempt to create space, to find safety. The faces of the guests blurred around her, a kaleidoscope of bright colors and polite smiles. She felt his gaze on her back, a burning weight that urged her to move faster, to disappear. She could almost feel the warmth of his eyes boring into her. Even as she moved further away, the air of the ballroom, once stifling, now felt cold on her flushed cheeks. She didn't dare look back. She reached Lady Clara, placing a hand on the child's small shoulder, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "Clara, dear, perhaps we should find somewhere a little quieter. You can tell me all about the lovely decorations." Lady Clara, oblivious to the silent drama that had just unfolded, nodded brightly, her blue eyes wide with innocent agreement. Eleanor gently steered the child towards a less crowded exit, her movements purposeful, almost frantic. The gentle pressure of Clara's hand in hers was a grounding force, a reminder of the precious life she was protecting, the reason for her desperate charade. As Eleanor stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the quieter antechamber, the sounds of the ballroom receded, but the image of Alaric Thorne's narrowed eyes, filled with a knowing certainty, remained burned into her mind. She pulled in a shaky breath, the crisp, cooler air doing little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Alaric watched her retreat, his gaze following her until she disappeared from view. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. She had denied him, skillfully and with admirable composure. But the slight tremble in her chin, the subtle tension in her hands, and the desperate haste of her exit spoke volumes. Her words were a fabrication, but her reactions, however fleeting, were genuine. He knew. He had found her. Despite her denials, despite the passage of 2 years, the woman he had sought with such relentless determination was finally within his grasp. The hunt, he realized, had just begun. Duke Alaric Thorne stood by the grand window of his study at Thorne Estate, the fading light of dusk painting the ancient room in hues of deep violet and gray. The silence, usually a comfort, now pressed against him, heavy with unanswered questions. His fingers, long and strong, absently traced the cold, rough stone of the window frame. Eleanor Vance. The name echoed in his mind, sharp and clear, yet devoid of the history he sought. He had seen her face, heard her voice, watched her deny everything. But he also saw the flicker, the undeniable instant of recognition in her gray eyes, mirroring his own. It was a contradiction he could not, would not ignore. He turned from the window, the rustle of his heavy wool coat a soft sound in the vast space. A servant had already lit the oil lamps, casting warm pools of light across the leather-bound books and dark, polished wood. He walked to his imposing desk, the surface gleaming under the lamplight. He picked up a small, silver letter opener, its cool metal a stark contrast to the heat that still simmered beneath his composed exterior. The memory of her hand, quick and instinctive, flying to her chest, remained vivid. That gesture, the touch of an unseen locket, had been the key, unlocking a 2-year-old mystery. He knew she was the woman he had sought, the elusive figure who had captured his imagination with a single fleeting encounter. Her denial, though perfectly delivered, felt like a flimsy veil. He remembered the slight tremor in her voice, barely perceptible to anyone else, but not to him. He remembered the way her gaze had darted, just for a moment, to the door, as if planning an escape. These small tells, almost imperceptible, only cemented his conviction. He pressed a hidden bell, and moments later, his aide, Thomas, entered the study. Thomas was a man of quiet efficiency, his loyalty as solid as the very foundations of Thorn Estate. He moved with a practiced ease, his expression neutral, awaiting instructions. "Thomas," Alaric began, his voice low, a controlled rumble in the quiet room. "I require some information." Thomas inclined his head slightly. "At your service, Your Grace." "The governess at Blackwood Manor," Alaric continued, his gaze unwavering, fixed on some distant point beyond Thomas. "Lady Clara's governess. I wish to know everything about her employment, her past references, how long she has been there, any details you can uncover." Thomas's eyes held no surprise, only a calm acceptance of the task. He knew his Duke well, understood the relentless pursuit behind such a request. "Understood, Your Grace. I will begin inquiries immediately." "Discreetly, Thomas," Alaric added, his voice sharpening slightly. "Utmost discretion. I do not wish to alarm her, or anyone else." "Of course, Your Grace," Thomas replied, his tone reassuring. He knew the delicate balance required when the Duke was on a particular trail. Thomas bowed and exited, leaving Alaric once more to the quiet company of his thoughts, which now raced with renewed purpose. He envisioned Eleanor, her delicate features, the way her gray eyes had held both fear and a defiant strength. He would uncover her truth. He had to. Meanwhile, at Blackwood Manor, Eleanor Vance moved through her days like a ghost, her senses sharpened by an invisible threat. Every creak of the floorboards, every hushed conversation in the hallway, every unfamiliar shadow sent a jolt of ice through her veins. The ball, a week past, felt both distant and terrifyingly close, its memory a persistent, gnawing ache in her chest. Duke Thorne's intense blue eyes, his probing question, her forced denial, they replayed themselves endlessly in her mind, a tormenting loop. She found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, a habit she had thought she'd broken years ago. Her reflection in the polished silver of a tea set startled her one morning, revealing wide, anxious eyes and a subtle tension around her mouth. She tried to maintain her usual calm demeanor for Lady Clara, reading stories with a steady voice, guiding her through arithmetic lessons with practiced patience. But inside, her stomach churned with a relentless dread, a cold knot tightening with each passing hour. One afternoon, while assisting Lady Clara with her embroidery, Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she threaded a needle. Lady Clara, sharp and perceptive, looked up. "Are you quite well, Miss Vance? Your hands are a little shaky today." Eleanor forced a smile, a thin, fragile thing. "Just a touch of the chill, my dear. Nothing to concern yourself with." She wished her heart would stop its frantic hammering against her ribs. The fear of being seen, truly seen, was a living thing breathing down her neck. She could feel Alaric's presence, his relentless gaze, even when he was miles away. It was an oppressive weight, a tightening band around her chest. Sleep offered little solace. Her dreams were fractured, filled with shadowy figures and the echoes of a past she desperately tried to bury. She would wake with a day, her sheets tangled, her forehead damp with a cold sweat. The first light of dawn, usually a gentle promise, now felt like an intrusion, a new day bringing new anxieties. She would rise, dress in the quiet pre-dawn hours, and sit by her window, watching the mist cling to the manicured gardens, her mind racing. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, each step precarious, the fall into exposure ever present. She clutched her silver locket beneath her plain gown, its familiar coolness a small comfort against her agitated skin. It was a desperate, almost unconscious habit, born of years of hiding. The memory of her hand flying to it at the ball, right when his eyes had found her, brought a fresh wave of panic. Had he truly noticed? Or was it merely her own paranoia twisting an innocent gesture into something damning? She longed for the anonymity she had so carefully constructed, the quiet peace of being invisible. Now it felt irrevocably shattered. Alaric, back at Thorn Estate, found his thoughts consumed by the encounter. He paced his study in the evenings, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards the only sound. He replayed their brief exchange countless times. "Have we met before, madam? Your face seems familiar." And her response, formal, cold, "I believe not, your grace. I am merely Lady Clara's governess." The words were a shield, expertly crafted, but the eyes, her gray eyes for a fleeting instant, had held a depth of emotion, a flash of something akin to terror. That flicker, that involuntary reaction, contradicted her denial entirely. He remembered the delicate curve of her arm, the way her dark hair, pulled back simply, framed a face that was both refined and worn by an unspoken hardship. Her composure was remarkable, almost too perfect. He had sensed the tension beneath it, a brittle strength that spoke of a deep secret. He was a man accustomed to reading people, to discerning truth from falsehood, and he was certain she lied. Not maliciously, perhaps, but out of necessity. This certainty, rather than easing his mind, only fueled his determination. He found himself sketching her face from memory late into the night, not with the detailed precision of a portrait artist, but with the quick, expressive lines that captured her essence. The slight arch of her brow, the curve of her lips, the intensity of her gaze. These sketches, scattered across his desk, were a silent testament to his growing obsession. He had hunted for 2 years, following whispers and faint trails, and now she was within reach. He would not let her slip away again. Days turned into a week, each one stretching Eleanor's nerves thinner. The constant vigilance was exhausting, draining her energy, dulling her senses, yet simultaneously heightening her awareness. She moved through the grand rooms of Blackwood Manor, its opulence now feeling like a gilded cage. The laughter of the other ladies, the murmur of conversation, all seemed to carry a hidden meaning, a whisper of discovery. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she were under a magnifying glass. Then, one brisk morning, Thomas returned to Thorn Estate. Alaric was in his study, as expected, a book open before him, though his eyes were not truly reading. He looked up as Thomas entered, a silent question in his piercing blue gaze. "Your Grace," Thomas began, his voice devoid of emotion, "I have made the inquiries you requested regarding Lady Clara Beaumont's governess." Alaric leaned forward slightly, his posture radiating an unspoken intensity. "And what have you discovered, Thomas?" "Her name is Eleanor Vance," Thomas reported, consulting a small notebook. "She arrived at Blackwood Manor approximately 2 years ago. Her references were impeccable, presented to Lady Beaumont by a solicitor known only as Mr. Davies. However, further investigation into Mr. Davies's chambers revealed no current address or contact information for him. He seems to have vanished shortly after placing Miss Vance." A muscle in Alaric's jaw tightened. "Untraceable, you say?" "Precisely, Your Grace. All attempts to locate previous employers or any direct family connections have yielded no results. It is as if she appeared out of thin air 2 years ago, fully formed, with a perfectly crafted yet ultimately unconfirmable history." Alaric rose from his chair, walking to the window once more. The sky outside was overcast, mirroring the growing storm within him. His suspicions were not just confirmed, they were intensified. 2 years ago, the exact time he had first encountered the woman who haunted his thoughts. Impeccable references from an untraceable source. A carefully constructed facade. He turned back to Thomas, his eyes alight with a cold, clear determination. "Thank you, Thomas. You have done well. It seems our governess holds more secrets than one might imagine." The sparse information, instead of deterring him, only solidified his resolve. Eleanor Vance was indeed the woman he sought, and her carefully woven tapestry of anonymity was now beginning to unravel. The polished floors of the Beaumont drawing room reflected the candlelight, casting a shimmering glow across faces Eleanor could not bring herself to properly see. Her vision seemed to narrow, focusing only on the periphery, searching for the shadow that might betray her. Duke Alaric Thorn was a constant, unsettling presence at these gatherings, a man who moved with a quiet power, his blue eyes perpetually scanning, always searching. Eleanor felt them, even when his back was turned, a phantom pressure on her skin. She gripped the delicate teacup, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that settled in her bones. Alaric, however, was a master of subtle strategy. He did not directly approach Eleanor after their brief, tense encounter at the ball. Instead, he worked the rooms, gliding from one group of nobles to another, a charming smile on his lips, an easy laugh escaping when appropriate. His questions, when they came, seemed innocent enough, woven into discussions of local affairs or the latest political gossip. He would inquire about the Beaumont children, then, as if an afterthought, ask about their governess. Lady Clara seems a bright child, he might remark to Lady Eleanor's cousin, a minor baroness, and her governess, a Miss Vance, I believe, appears most capable. What do you know of her background? The Baroness, flattered by the Duke's attention, would preen slightly, offering vague praises of Eleanor's quiet efficiency. Alaric would nod, his gaze never quite still, observing the flicker in her eyes, the slight hesitation before she spoke. He looked for anything that might suggest a deeper knowledge, a hidden past. He tried this approach with several others, lords and ladies, minor gentry, and those who frequented the same social circles as the Beaumonts. He learned little beyond what his aide had already reported. Eleanor Vance was discreet, hardworking, and had arrived 2 years ago with impeccable, yet untraceable references. The lack of concrete details only deepened his conviction. It was too perfect, too convenient. His frustration grew with each empty conversation, each polite but uninformative response. Yet the memory of her hand flying to her chest, her gray eyes flashing with a primal fear before she masked it, burned in his mind. He knew it was her. He could feel it in his gut, a certainty that defied logic. The scent of her, a faint trace of lavender and something earthy, almost like rain on dry soil, lingered in his memory. He heard her voice in his dreams, soft yet firm, denying him, denying everything. He wanted to hear it again, speaking the truth. Meanwhile, Eleanor's life at Blackwood Manor became a constant exercise in self-control. She moved through her days like a phantom, her senses heightened, every sound a potential threat. The whispers began subtly, a murmur from the kitchen staff about Duke Thorne's sudden, unusual interest in the manor. Then they grew bolder, circulating among the other governesses who occasionally gathered for tea. "Did you hear?" one might confide, lowering her voice. "The Duke has been asking about Miss Vance, rather persistent, I gather." Eleanor, serving tea in the drawing room, her hands steady despite the tremor inside her, would feel a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She could taste the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. She'd pretend not to hear, focusing on refilling up, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the porcelain. But the words were like tiny barbs, pricking at her carefully constructed composure. She saw the speculative glances, the curiosity in their eyes, and she felt utterly exposed, as if her skin had been peeled away, leaving her nerves raw and trembling. The air in the manor, once a comforting blanket of routine, now felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken questions. She would retreat to her small room, the thin walls offering little solace. The scratch of her pen on parchment as she corrected Clara's lessons would be the only sound, a desperate attempt to ground herself. But her mind would race, imagining scenarios, escape routes, each one more desperate than the last. She ran her fingers over the faded velvet of her worn armchair, finding no comfort in its familiar texture. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She knew she could not stay. The longer she remained, the greater the risk. But where could she go? She had exhausted every option, burned every bridge. One afternoon, a week after the ball, Alaric found his opportunity. Lady Clara was in the extensive manor gardens, attempting to sketch a particularly vibrant rosebush, her governess briefly occupied with a household matter. Alaric, having ridden over on a pretense of discussing a land boundary with Lord Beaumont, saw Clara alone, her golden curls catching the sunlight. He approached her gently, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. "Lady Clara," he said, his voice a low, kind rumble, "that is a magnificent rose you are capturing." Clara looked up, her blue eyes wide and innocent. "Good day, Your Grace." Miss Vance says one must observe closely to truly draw what one sees. She held up her sketch pad, a child's earnest rendition of petals. Alaric knelt, feigning genuine interest in her drawing. Indeed, she is quite right. Your governess seems a very wise woman. Do you enjoy your lessons with her? He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that rarely reached his eyes these days. Clara beamed. Oh yes, she teaches me so much. Not just numbers and letters, but about the stars and how the world works. She even knows stories about faraway lands. She pointed to a smudged detail on her drawing. This little leaf, Miss Vance told me it represents resilience. Resilience, Alaric repeated, his gaze shifting from the sketch to Clara's animated face. She sounds like a remarkable lady. She must have many interesting stories of her own. He watched Clara's expression closely, looking for the telltale signs of a child's unguarded truth. Does she ever share them with you? Clara tilted her head, considering. Sometimes, not really stories, but little bits. She doesn't talk much about herself. She is very private. She paused, then leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a whisper. But she has a secret, a very special secret. Alaric felt a jolt, a sudden quickening of his pulse. This was it. This was the opening he had been waiting for. He kept his expression neutral, patient. Oh, a secret? Do tell, Lady Clara. I am quite fond of secrets. Clara giggled, delighted by his apparent interest. It's a locket, a tiny silver locket. She wears it always, under her dress. Sometimes when she is thinking or when she is sad, her hand just goes to it, like this. Clara mimicked the gesture, her small hand flying to her own chest, tapping lightly where Eleanor's locket would rest. She touches it, as if it gives her strength. Alaric's breath caught in his throat. The gardens blurred around him, the scent of roses suddenly overwhelming. He felt a profound sense of triumph, a rush that was almost dizzying. It was her. The locket, the involuntary gesture. The missing piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, delivered by the innocent lips of an 8-year-old girl. He looked at Clara, then beyond her, his eyes narrowed, now seeing the path to Eleanor with absolute, terrifying clarity. The scent of polished wood and old parchment filled Lord Beaumont's study, a heavy fragrance Alaric Thorne had come to associate with quiet power and careful negotiations. He sat opposite the older man, his posture relaxed, yet every nerve in his body was alert. The morning light, filtered through tall, leaded windows, cast long shadows across the Persian rug, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Alaric had requested this meeting under the guise of discussing land boundaries, a matter he usually delegated. But today it served a far more personal purpose. The silver locket, the small, unconscious gesture from Eleanor, had confirmed his long-held suspicion. Now he needed details. He spoke of timber yields and grazing rights, his voice a low, steady murmur, watching Lord Beaumont's reactions with an almost predatory focus. The older noble, a man of comfortable means and predictable routines, responded with genuine interest, unaware of the true agenda hidden beneath the polite veneer. Alaric sipped his tea, the warm porcelain cup a pleasant weight in his hand, but his mind remained a cold, calculating machine. He steered the conversation with the precision of a master huntsman, circling his prey. He complimented Lord Beaumont on the excellent management of his estate, then smoothly transitioned to the well-being of his household. Your daughter, Lady Clara, always seems in remarkably high spirits, Alaric observed, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Her education must be handled with great care. Lord Beaumont beamed, a proud father. Indeed, Your Grace. Clara is a bright girl, a credit to her lineage. Her governess, Miss Vance, has proven herself quite capable. Excellent references, too. He picked up a small silver letter opener, turning it over and over in his fingers. The sound of its soft click against the desk was the only interruption to the hushed quiet of the room. Alaric nodded slowly, as if deep in thought. Miss Vance, you say? I believe I caught a glimpse of her at your ball. A rather striking presence, even amidst the grandeur. He paused, letting the statement hang, a bait left subtly on the hook. He watched for any shift in Lord Beaumont's demeanor, any flicker of concern or deeper knowledge. He heard the faint rustle of the heavy velvet curtains as a breeze ghosted through the room, Lord Beaumont chuckled, a deep rumbling sound. Ah, yes, Eleanor, quiet, but efficient. She handles Clara admirably. Came to us 2 years ago, I believe, from a rather reputable agency in the capital, though I confess I cannot recall the name at present. He waved a dismissive hand, a common gesture from men who rarely troubled themselves with such administrative details. Her background checks were impeccable, of course. A respectable, if somewhat impoverished, gentlewoman fallen on hard times, as so many are these days. Alaric felt a tightening in his chest, a jolt of satisfaction mixed with an almost desperate frustration. 2 years, the same amount of time he had been searching. Impoverished gentlewoman. This matched his vague memories, the sense of a woman out of place, yet carrying herself with an innate grace. He tasted the faint bitterness of the tea, a counterpoint to the sweetness of discovery. He needed more. He needed to know what had brought her here, what secrets she carried. Indeed, Alaric murmured, his eyes fixed on a portrait of a stern-faced ancestor on the wall. It is a difficult age for many. One always hopes to offer a deserving soul a chance. And her demeanor, her character, you find them above reproach. He phrased it carefully, a question that hinted at deeper scrutiny without being overtly accusatory. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as Alaric waited for the answer. Lord Beaumont shifted in his chair, a slight frown touching his brow. Miss Vance is a model of decorum, Your Grace. Quiet, reserved, perhaps a little too much so at times. Never a word out of place, always dedicated to Clara's studies. She keeps to herself, which for a governess is often a virtue. No gossip, no frivolity, a true asset. He picked up a decorative paperweight, running a thumb over its smooth, cold surface. A woman of good breeding, one can tell, despite her present circumstances. Alaric absorbed every word, reserved, keeps to herself, good breeding. It painted a picture of a woman deliberately cloaked, meticulously guarded. His suspicion hardened into near certainty. The pieces were falling into place, slowly but surely. He knew his search was nearing its end. He felt a strange mix of anticipation and a peculiar tenderness, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He wondered what hardships had led her to such a life, hiding her natural grace beneath a governess's plain attire. He could almost hear the faint rustle of her gown as she moved, the memory of her swift, elegant retreat from the ball still vivid in his mind. He smiled, a genuine, if fleeting, smile that surprised even himself. It sounds as though Lady Clara is in excellent hands, Lord Beaumont. My appreciation for your diligence in such matters is profound. He then skillfully turned the conversation back to estate matters, tying up the loose ends of his pretense. He spoke for another 20 minutes, his focus unwavering, until he could politely take his leave. As he walked from the study, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a soft thud, a quiet exultation hummed beneath his calm exterior. He had what he needed. The hunt was almost over. The feeling of the cool, crisp autumn air on his face as he stepped outside was invigorating. Meanwhile, Eleanor Vance felt the walls closing in around her. The whispers in the servants' hall had grown louder, more pointed, like tiny needles pricking her skin. Duke Thorne's interest, they murmured, their voices barely audible, yet each word echoed like a thunderclap in her mind. She saw the speculative glances from the other governesses, their faces a mixture of envy and suspicion. The very air of Blackwood Manor, once a haven of quiet anonymity, now felt charged with unseen scrutiny. She spent her evenings in her small, sparsely furnished room, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her fragile peace. She ran a weary hand over the worn surface of her small, wooden desk, feeling the familiar texture. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a constant drumbeat of fear. Every knock on her door sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Every footstep in the corridor outside made her freeze, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen the Duke's carriage leave this morning, a dark, imposing vehicle, and a cold dread had settled deep in her stomach. He was making inquiries. She knew it with a certainty that left her breathless. The thought was a bitter taste in her mouth, like ashes. She gazed out her window at the darkening sky, the last vestiges of twilight fading into a deep, starless black. The grounds of Blackwood Manor, usually a comforting sight, now seemed vast and isolating. She could almost feel Alaric Thorne's blue eyes on her, even from afar, a relentless, searching gaze that pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. Her composure, once an impenetrable shield, now felt like a thin, brittle pane of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The image of his stern, aristocratic face, the intensity of his stare at the ball, haunted her waking hours and invaded her fitful sleep. She knew she could not stay. The longer she remained, the greater the risk of exposure, of her past tearing through the fragile fabric of her present. The thought of leaving Lady Clara, the sweet, intelligent child who had brought a flicker of warmth back into her desolate life, brought a fresh wave of pain. Clara's small, trusting hand in hers, her innocent questions, her bright, inquisitive eyes, they were precious anchors in a sea of loneliness. Leaving her would feel like tearing a piece of her own heart away. She closed her eyes and a single tear traced a path down her temple, cool against her skin. She heard the distant hoot of an owl, a mournful sound in the vast silence. But what choice did she have? Her very existence here was a gamble, and Alaric Thorne was a force of nature, relentless and powerful. She had always known this precarious peace could not last forever. She had merely hoped for more time, for a chance to find a more permanent refuge. She pressed her fingers to the silver locket hidden beneath her dress, feeling its familiar, cool weight against her skin. It was her only tangible link to a life she had lost, a past she could never reclaim, and a future that felt increasingly bleak. The faded engraving of the crest, smooth and worn, was a constant reminder of who she once was and who she could no longer be. Resignation. The word formed in her mind, heavy and inevitable. It was the only way. To flee, to disappear once more into the anonymity of the sprawling city, to seek another obscure position, even if it meant less comfort, more hardship. She would find a way. She always had. The prospect was daunting, a chilling plunge into the unknown, but it was better than facing the terrifying certainty of Alaric Thorne's relentless pursuit. She would write the letter tonight, after Clara was asleep, after the manor had settled into its deep, creaking silence. She would present it to Lord Beaumont first thing in the morning, before Alaric Thorne could tighten his grip any further. The inkwell on her desk sat dark and inviting, waiting for her decision. She straightened her shoulders, a renewed resolve firming her jaw. Her hands trembled slightly, but a spark of defiance, a familiar fire flickered within her. She would not be hunted down like a common criminal. She would take control, even if it meant sacrificing the small comfort she had found. She imagined the words she would write, polite yet firm, citing family matters, a need to return to distant relatives. It would be a lie, but a necessary one, a shield against the truth she dared not speak. The rough texture of the paper beneath her fingers felt like a bridge to a new uncertain path. She began to gather her few possessions, her movements slow and deliberate. Her worn leather-bound book of poems, a small sewing kit, a faded ribbon Clara had given her. Each item felt laden with memories, each a testament to the quiet life she had built. The thought of packing them away again, of severing her ties, brought a fresh wave of despair that threatened to overwhelm her newfound resolve. She paused, holding a delicate embroidery hoop, her fingers tracing the intricate stitches. She heard the soft hum of the night, the distant bark of a dome, sounds that used to comfort her, but now only amplified her isolation. Just as she reached for her pen, her heart still heavy with the impending farewell, a sharp, insistent knock echoed on her door. It was not the gentle tap of a maid, nor the familiar light rap of Clara. This was firm, authoritative, a sound that immediately sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Her breath hitched. She froze, her hand still hovering over the parchment, her mind racing. Who could it be at this hour? The late hour suggested urgency, and urgency for her always meant danger. The door creaked open slightly, revealing the grim face of Mrs. Finch, the head housekeeper. Mrs. Finch's usually crisp apron seemed a little crumpled, her expression unusually serious. In her hand, she held a folded piece of thick, cream-colored parchment, sealed with a dark wax impression. The sight of it made Eleanor's blood run cold. She saw the familiar, imposing crest of the Thorne estate emblazoned on the wax. Her carefully constructed plan, her desperate attempt to outmaneuver fate, crashed down around her. A messenger from Thorne Estate, Miss Vance, Mrs. Finch announced, her voice hushed, almost apologetic. He insisted upon delivering this to you directly, immediately. She extended the letter, her hands steady, though her eyes held a spark of knowing curiosity. The air in the small room suddenly felt thin, suffocating. Eleanor took the summons, her fingers trembling as they closed around the heavy paper. The weight of it felt immense, like a stone in her hand. She heard the faint crackle as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the elegant, decisive script. It was a formal request, or rather, a command. Her presence was required at Thorne Estate for a discussion regarding Lady Clara's educational future. The words were polite, professional, yet beneath them lay an undeniable, chilling authority. It was from the Duke himself. He had found her. Her escape had been thwarted before it even began. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Each jolt of the carriage carried Eleanor Vance deeper into the Duke's domain, closer to what she knew was coming. She pressed cold fingers into her clammy palm, a tremor shaking her arm. The summons was a command, a polite demand. Her carefully built world was collapsing. The iron gates of Thorne Estate loomed, swinging open. This place was a fortress, a symbol of the man within. The manor's stone walls rose dark under the overcast sky. A chill seeped through her cloak, settling deep inside her. She thought of Lady Clara, her sweet charge, and guilt tightened her chest. This meeting would expose her and shatter her 2 years of stability. The carriage stopped before a heavy oak door studded with iron. A footman, his face expressionless, opened it. Eleanor stepped onto the gravel, her boots crunching loudly in the estate's stillness. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. She followed the footman through echoing halls, polished marble reflecting muted light. Tapestries of stern ancestors stared down. Each painting whispered of generations of power. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm. She felt like a moth caught in a web, drawn to its center. The footman paused before a grand, imposing door. He rapped twice. The sound vibrated through the floorboards. A deep voice from within gave permission. The footman opened the door, revealing a vast, elegant study. He gestured for Eleanor to enter, then closed the heavy door behind her. The click sounded like a prison cell locking. Duke Alaric Thorne stood by a tall window, his back to her, looking at the gardens. The room had dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a massive desk. A scent of old paper, tobacco, and something masculine filled the air. Fire crackled softly, casting shadows across the Duke's broad shoulders. Eleanor's breath hitched. His presence in that vast room amplified her vulnerability, emphasizing his power. She stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped, knuckles white. She tried to steady her veins. Her throat felt dry, fear metallic on her tongue. The silence stretched, broken only by the fire in her heart. He turned slowly, his sharp blue eyes fixing on her. His gaze stripped away her defenses. It held no warmth, only a surgical examination. "Miss Vance," he said, his deep voice filling the room, vibrating through her. It commanded attention, leaving no room for doubt. "Thank you for coming." His polite words held an unshakable certainty, a quiet triumph. Eleanor felt a tremor in her knees. She managed a small nod. She could not speak. Her voice would betray the terror in her gut. She swallowed hard, trying to moisten her parched throat. "Please sit." He gestured to a plush chair opposite his massive desk, like an interrogation chair. Eleanor moved mechanically, her legs numb. She sank into the velvet chair, finding no comfort against the cold dread. She kept her gaze past his shoulder, unable to meet his eyes. She felt exposed, every thought laid bare. The low chair made her look up at him, a power play she recognized. Alaric moved from the window, his steps deliberate. He settled into his chair behind the desk, his gaze still on her. He steepled his fingers, resting his chin, a thoughtful look on his face. Firelight glinted in his dark hair, highlighting his sharp features. "I believe we have much to discuss, Miss Vance," he began, his voice calm. "Or perhaps it is I who has much to reveal." Eleanor's grip tightened on the chair arms. She wished she could disappear, escape his presence. This was the moment. the game was over. She braced for the inevitable. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice thin, "I'm afraid I do not understand." It was a futile denial, even as her heart screamed the truth. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips, acknowledging her pretense. "Oh, I believe you do, Miss Vance," he said, his voice dropping, growing dangerous. "You understand perfectly." He paused, letting the statement hang. A cold sweat broke out on Eleanor's forehead. Her face drained of color, leaving her skin clammy. Her fingers locked around the chair arm, nails digging into the wood. "2 years ago," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "I encountered a woman. She captivated me for a brief, unforgettable moment." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. Then she vanished, leaving me to search relentlessly. Eleanor's breath caught. He spoke of that night with such certainty, it stole her air. She looked away as if to physically escape the memories. She had hoped the encounter was as fleeting for him as she tried to make it for herself. "I have spent 24 months seeking her," Alaric stated, his voice now edged with steel. "I pursued every lead, investigated every rumor, followed every whisper across the continent." He paused. "And then, at a ball in the home of the Beaumonts, I found her." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of panic. He was dismantling her defenses, leaving no room to maneuver. She bit the inside of her cheek, focusing on the pain over her despair. "You, Miss Vance, denied me," he said, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. "You claimed we had never met. You presented yourself as a simple governess, unknown to me." His eyes narrowed. "A masterful performance, I must admit." The faint praise stung, an accusation. Eleanor felt a surge of defiance, a cornered animal's last stand. "I am Lady Clara's governess, Your Grace," she stated, her voice trembling, "and I stand by my words. I have never met you prior to the Beaumont ball." Alaric's lips thinned with impatience. "Indeed," he said, his voice colder. "You are very good at maintaining appearances. Impeccable references from an untraceable source, I was told. A past that simply begins 2 years ago, when you arrived at Blackwood Manor." He gestured, "a perfectly constructed new identity for a woman who wished to disappear." Eleanor's heart hammered. He knew too much. He had peeled back her anonymity. Her mind raced for an escape, a rebuttal, but there was nothing. Only the cold facts, each a nail in the coffin of her secret life. "My investigations," Alaric continued, his gaze unwavering, "revealed very little initially, a blank slate, but there were small, telling details." He leaned back, watching her. "Whispers among the servants, a protectiveness Lady Clara showed toward you. And then there was the locket." The word hung, a bell tolling the end of her freedom. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her hand flew to her chest, fingers brushing the cold silver beneath her dress. It was an involuntary reflex, a comfort she sought for 2 years. As soon as she made the gesture, she knew her mistake. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent scream in her mind. "Ah," Alaric said, grim satisfaction in his voice. "There it is, the gesture. The very gesture that confirmed everything for me at the ball." His voice was low, chillingly certain. "That small, involuntary touch of your hand to your chest, to that silver locket." Eleanor's eyes snapped open, despair washing over her. He had seen it. He had known. Her one comfort, a link to a buried past, had become her undoing. The room tilted. The scent of old books became suffocating. "Lady Clara, innocent and observant, mentioned it to me," he revealed, his voice softer now, yet unrelenting. "Your secret locket," she called it. "A small, silver one you often touch." He paused, letting the evidence press. "It is the same locket, is it not, that you wore that night 2 years ago?" His question was a statement of inescapable truth. Eleanor's world tilted. The wall she had meticulously built crumbled before her. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering her defenses, revealing the vulnerable woman beneath. There was nowhere left to hide. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The metallic taste intensified. She tried to speak, to deny it, but words caught in her throat, choked by shame and despair. Her composure, fiercely protected for years, fractured. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a path down her pale cheek. Another followed, then another. Her vision blurred, the study and the Duke dissolving into a watery haze. Tears welled in her gray eyes, betraying everything. A single tear, hot and heavy, broke free from the corner of Eleanor's eye. It traced a slow, burning path down her cheek, a stark betrayal of the composure she had meticulously maintained for years. Her vision blurred, the imposing lines of Duke Alaric's study dissolving into a shimmering haze of rich mahogany and aged leather. The air, thick with old books and unspoken tension, felt suffocating. Her lungs burned, desperate for a breath she could not draw. She tried to speak another defiant word, but her throat constricted, a tight knot of fear and exhaustion. A choke sound escaped instead, a small, wounded gasp that ripped through the room's quiet dignity. Her shoulders began to tremble, a subtle tremor at first, then a violent shudder that shook her entire frame. The carefully constructed wall, brick by painful brick, began to crack. She felt a seismic shift within her, the foundation of her entire false life crumbling into dust. Her hands, previously clenched tight in her lap, now flew to cover her face, trying to hide the cascade of tears that followed the first. She felt the warmth of her own skin against her palms, the dampness spreading rapidly. Each sob was a wrenching release, a torrent of grief and fear held captive for 2 long years. The sound was raw, unrefined, utterly unlike the quiet, precise governess she pretended to be. It was the sound of a woman stripped bare, defenseless. Alaric watched her, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her bowed head. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of aristocratic control. Yet a subtle tension in his jaw, a slight tightening around his eyes, suggested a deeper reaction. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by Eleanor's ragged breathing and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of her crying. He had hunted her, pursued her, and now she was here, broken before him. The triumph he had anticipated felt hollow, overshadowed by something far more complicated. She slowly lowered her hands, her face blotchy and stained with tears, her gray eyes swollen and red. They met his gaze for a fleeting moment, a desperate plea for understanding, before darting away, ashamed of her vulnerability. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold her shattering pieces together. The cold stone of the fireplace seemed to press in, a physical manifestation of the crushing weight of her secrets. She could taste the salt of her tears on her lips, a bitter reminder of her unraveling. I cannot, she whispered, her voice raspy, barely audible. I cannot keep it inside any longer. The words were an admission of defeat, a surrender to the inevitable. She took another shuddering breath, trying to compose herself, but the effort was futile. The dam had broken. She needed to speak, to unburden herself of the crushing weight she had carried alone. It was a desperate need, almost physical, like needing to breathe after being underwater for too long. They said I was responsible, she began, her voice gaining a fragile strength, though still laced with pain. For everything, for the ruin. She paused, swallowing hard, memories flashing behind her eyes. The opulent ballrooms, the whispered rumors, the sudden chill of isolation. The betrayal had not come from an enemy, but from those she had trusted most. It had been swift and brutal, leaving her adrift in a sea of condemnation. The scent of dust and decay, the taste of stale bread, the feel of rough fabric on her skin. These were the memories of her fall. My family, they were brought low, she continued, her gaze fixed on a distant point, seeing not the elegant study, but the wreckage of her past. Not by my choice, never by my choice, but by those who sought to gain. They twisted the truth, poisoned the wells of trust. Her words painted a picture of a world turned upside down, a life of privilege replaced by relentless struggle. She spoke of the sudden loss, not just of wealth, but of reputation, of identity, the shock of being cast out, of becoming an outcast in the society she had once belonged to, the desperate scramble to serve him, to find refuge where no one knew her name. The cold nights, the gnawing hunger, the constant fear of recognition. Alaric remained silent, his stillness a powerful presence in the room. He did not move, did not interrupt, allowing her the space to unburden herself. His intense gaze never left her face, watching every flicker of emotion, every tremble of her lip. He was absorbing her story, piecing together the fragments of the woman he had sought with singular focus. There was a dawning understanding in his eyes, a shift from pure determination to something deeper, more nuanced. "I had to disappear," Eleanor explained, her voice growing stronger, a note of fierce defiance creeping in. "To shed my name, my past, to become someone else, someone unremarkable. It was the only way to protect what little I had left." She spoke of the loneliness, the constant vigilance required to maintain her disguise, the meticulous care with which she crafted her new identity, selecting every word, every gesture, to ensure no one would ever suspect the truth. The fear had been a constant companion, a cold hand gripping her heart every time she heard a familiar name, every time a shadow passed too close. The silver locket, pressed against her skin, had been her only tangible link to a life that no longer existed. The scandal, it was horrific, she confessed, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laden with a shame not hers to bear. A web of lies, spun by envious hands. They blamed me for a betrayal I did not commit, for a deception that destroyed everything. My father, he believed them, or he was forced to. A fresh wave of tears threatened to overwhelm her, but she fought them back, her jaw tight. The pain of her father's turning away, or his forced compliance, was a wound that had never truly healed. It was a betrayal from within her own family, a deeper cut than any inflicted by outsiders. She felt the phantom pressure of his hand, brushing her hair from her face, now replaced by the cold memory of his accusing stare. The air in the study felt heavy, thick with the echoes of her sorrow. "I ran," she admitted, a stark, raw confession. "I ran from the whispers, from the accusations, from the very air that choked me. I changed my name. I found work. Anything to be forgotten, to be invisible." She spoke of the governess position, a lifeline in a desperate situation. The quiet routine, the structured days, offered a semblance of peace, a fragile sanctuary from the storm that raged within her. Lady Clara's innocent affection had been an unexpected balm, a tiny flicker of warmth in her otherwise bleak existence. But even that small comfort had been shadowed by the constant dread of discovery. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the study seemed to amplify the silence that followed her words. Alaric shifted slightly in his chair, a subtle movement that drew her eyes to him. He still looked impassive, but his gaze held a depth she had not seen before. It was as if he was seeing beyond the governess's plain facade, peering into the very soul of the woman he had pursued. There was no judgment in his eyes, only an intense, almost unnerving absorption. "I built this new life brick by painful brick," she explained. "A quiet life, a small life, where no one would ever find me, where no one would ever suspect who I truly was." She recounted the constant fear of encountering someone from her past, the meticulous avoidance of social gatherings, the careful crafting of her speech and mannerisms. The sheer exhaustion of living a lie, day in and day out, weighed heavily on her. Every polite smile, every measured response, had been a conscious effort, a performance designed to keep her secret safe. The silver locket, a constant, comforting weight against her skin, had been her only true confidant. "Then you," she said, her voice dropping, her eyes finally locking with his, a fierce desperation in their depths. "You saw me. You knew, even when I tried to deny it." Her confession hung in the air, a fragile thing, exposed and vulnerable. She had laid bare her deepest fears, her most painful memories, to a man who had once been her hunter. Now her fate, her very existence, rested in his hands. The enormity of it, the absolute surrender, made her heart pound with a terrifying mixture of relief and utter dread. She took a deep, shaky breath, her gaze never leaving his. The words that followed were barely a whisper, imbued with the full weight of her shattered past, her hidden identity, and the scandalous truth she had buried for so long. "My true name is Eleanor Ashworth," she confessed, her voice catching on the familiar syllables, a name she had not spoken aloud in 2 years. "And the events that forced me into hiding, they revolve around the Ashworth estate, a forged will, and a marriage contract broken under false pretenses. They ruined my family, stripped us of everything, and left me branded as a conniving opportunist, all to seize our lands and fortune. Her voice trembled with the finality of her confession, leaving her fate entirely in Alaric's powerful hands. The last word left Eleanor's lips like a gasp, a whisper lost in the vastness of the Duke's study. Her breath caught in her own throat, and exposed. The air hung heavy with the weight of her confession. Each syllable a stone dropped into a deep, silent well. She could taste the metallic tang of fear and unshed tears on her tongue, her body trembling from the exhaustion of holding back such agonizing secrets for so long. Her gaze remained fixed on Alaric, a man who held her future, her very existence, in his formidable grasp. Every muscle in her body was coiled, braced for the judgment she felt was surely coming, a condemnation that would finally shatter her fragile peace. Alaric stood perfectly still, a silent, imposing figure against the tall, dark-paneled walls of his study. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy dread that had settled deep within Eleanor. His piercing blue eyes, which had never left her face throughout her harrowing tale, now seemed to gaze beyond her, into a distant, unseen horizon. He was absorbing, processing, sifting through the layers of deceit and despair she had just unveiled. Eleanor felt a cold sweat prickle her skin, despite the room's warmth, her fingers locking around the fabric of her simple gown. She wanted to look away, to hide from his intense scrutiny, but she could not. His silence was a torment, far worse than any harsh words he might have uttered. A profound realization settled over Alaric. This woman, the one he had pursued with such single-minded obsession for 2 years, was not merely a captivating enigma. She was a woman of immense courage, forced to forge a new life from the ashes of a devastating past. Her story, filled with betrayal and profound loss, resonated with a depth he had not anticipated. His relentless hunt had been driven by a fascination, a desire to possess the mystery she represented. Now the mystery was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding humanity that stirred something unexpected within him. The air in the opulent study seemed to press down on Eleanor, each tick of the grandfather clock an anvil striking against her already bruised spirit. He saw the fear in her gray eyes, mirroring the desolation she had just described. He recognized the strength in her voice, even as it cracked with emotion, revealing a spirit that had endured unimaginable hardship. The carefully constructed facade of the governess, so composed and distant, had crumbled, exposing a woman who was vulnerable, yet fiercely resilient. This raw vulnerability, so starkly revealed in his imposing study, stirred a deep, unfamiliar sensation within Alaric. It was not the thrill of the chase, nor the satisfaction of discovery. It was something far more profound, something that resonated in the quiet, guarded chambers of his own heart. The scent of old leather and wood polish filled the room, a scent that typically brought him comfort, but now felt stifling, charged with unspoken expectation. His mind raced, weighing the implications of her revelation. The danger she spoke of was real, the consequences of her exposure potentially catastrophic. He held her entire future in his hands, a power he had sought, but now found himself burdened by. Could he simply dismiss her, cast her back into the shadows from which he had dragged her? The thought was fleeting, dismissed almost immediately. The man he was, the Duke Alaric Thorne, did not abandon those who had trusted him, even when that trust was born of desperation. The light from the window was fading, casting long, dramatic shadows across the room, making Alaric's expression even harder to discern. His obsession, which had been a driving force for so long, began to shift, to transform. It was no longer a hunt for an ethereal memory, but a nascent desire to protect this fragile yet formidable woman. The thought surprised him, a sudden, powerful current beneath the surface of his carefully controlled demeanor. He had always been a man of action, of calculated decisions. This feeling, this spontaneous welling of protectiveness, was new, unwelcome in its intensity, yet undeniably compelling. Eleanor watched him, every nerve ending screaming, her breath so shallow she felt lightheaded. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let more tears fall. She had spilled enough already. Eleanor observed the subtle tension in Alaric's jaw, the slight furrowing of his brow. He was not looking at her with anger nor with triumph, but with an intensity that baffled her. Was it pity? disgust, or something else entirely. She had braced herself for the worst, for him to use her past against her, to expose her for his own amusement or gain. Yet he remained silent, locked in his own thoughts, his presence a heavy, undeniable weight in the room. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, were cold, her knuckles white. She felt a shiver trace its way down her spine, a desperate chill that no fire could dispel. Alaric's gaze finally returned to her, direct and unwavering. He saw the faint smudges beneath her eyes, the strain etched around her mouth, the desperate plea in her tear-filled gaze. He saw the small, delicate curve of her jaw, the way her dark hair, usually so neatly pinned, had escaped its confines, framing her face in soft tendrils. He saw Eleanor, not the elusive phantom of his memory, but a living, breathing woman, scarred by life, yet undeniably vibrant. The contrast between her fragility and her evident strength captivated him anew, drawing him further into a tangled web of emotion he had never anticipated. The scent of her, subtle and clean, reached him even across the distance that separated them. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. The decision was forming, solidifying in his mind. The power he held over her fate was immense, but so too was the responsibility. He could crush her, or he could uplift her. He could expose her, or he could shield her. The choice, he realized, was not about him, not about his obsession, but about her. It was about the woman sitting before him, stripped bare of all her defenses, trusting him with the most dangerous secrets of her life. He knew what he had to do, a path that felt both inevitable and entirely unexpected. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Each passing second stretched into an eternity, an unbearable suspense that threatened to consume her. She could not breathe, could not think, could only watch, her entire being focused on the man before her. His next words would irrevocably determine the course of her entire future, sealing her fate for good or ill. The grand room with its heavy drapes and antique furnishings seemed to shrink around her, pressing in, making her feel small and insignificant. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, a desperate prayer escaping her lips, unheard, unformed. Then Alaric moved. It was a subtle shift, a gentle inclination of his head, a softening around his sharp features. He took a single step closer, then another, bridging the distance between them with quiet purpose. Eleanor's eyes flew open, wide and startled, as he stopped directly before her chair. The air crackled with an unspoken energy, a tension that was almost unbearable, yet strangely magnetic. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark warmth against her cold skin. His shadow fell over her, enveloping her in a brief, comforting darkness. He looked into her tear-filled eyes, a gaze that was no longer probing or intense, but held a profound depth of understanding. A silent message passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity, of unspoken burdens. Then, with a gentle, unexpected gesture that brought a sudden catch to Eleanor's throat, he slowly reached out his hand. His strong, capable fingers extended towards her, not demanding, not threatening, but offering something she had not felt in years. He touched her trembling hand, his warmth a startling, grounding sensation against her cold skin, and a silent, profound promise hung in the air between them. Her skin burned where his fingers rested, a jolt, not of fear but something electric, shooting through her. Eleanor's breath hitched, a fragile sound lost in the vast silence of the Duke's study. His touch was firm, yet surprisingly gentle, anchoring her in a moment she thought she might float away from, a moment balanced precariously between her shattered past and an unknown future. She watched him, her gaze clinging to his, searching for any hint of judgment, any trace of the relentless hunter she had known him to be. What she found instead was a stillness, a quiet intensity that promised something more profound than mere triumph. Duke Alaric's thumb moved, a barely perceptible stroke across the back of her hand, sending a shiver through her. His blue eyes, which had always held such piercing determination, now softened around the edges, reflecting a depth of emotion Eleanor had never imagined possible. The air in the room, once heavy with her fear and his unyielding will, seemed to lighten, to breathe with a new, shared understanding. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to fill the very spaces within her, settling around her like a protective cloak. "I will protect your secret, Eleanor," he began, his words carrying the weight of his considerable influence. "No one will ever know the truth of your past, not from me, not from anyone within my reach." His gaze held hers, unwavering, a silent vow passing between them. "I will use every resource at my command to clear your name, to unravel the web of deceit that forced you into this desolate life." The promise was immense, a beacon in the darkness that had consumed her for so long. She had lived under the shadow of a lie, fleeing from a scandal that was not her own, and now he offered to dissolve it, to erase the very thing that had defined her existence. But there was more, she knew, a condition that hung unspoken in the air, a silent chord vibrating between them. Alaric paused, his eyes studying her face as if seeking permission to speak the words that would bind them. "But there is a condition, Eleanor," he finally said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word resonated with absolute clarity. "You must trust me, completely and without reservation, and you must agree to stay by my side." The words echoed in her mind, "Stay by my side." For a woman who had spent 2 years running, hiding, cherishing her precarious independence, even in poverty, this was a monumental proposal. It was not just a physical presence he requested, but a commitment, a bond that felt both impossibly high and utterly negligible when compared to the freedom from constant dread he offered. Was it a cage or a sanctuary? Her heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against her ribs, caught between the terror of commitment and the overwhelming allure of safety. A wave of dizzying relief washed over her, so potent it threatened to buckle her knees. The years of gnawing fear, of constant vigilance, of the cold ache of loneliness, they all seemed to recede, pushed back by the sheer force of his unexpected kindness. She had been prepared for judgment, for dismissal, perhaps even for a new form of captivity, but never for this. Never for an offer that promised not just safety, but a future she had long since abandoned hope of possessing. The thought of truly belonging somewhere, after so long adrift, of having an ally against the world, was intoxicating, a sweet poison she was desperate to drink. Her eyes, still wet with unshed tears, searched his again. She saw not the relentless pursuer, but a man who had chosen to understand, to protect. His touch on her hand felt like a lifeline, a tangible connection to a reality where she might finally breathe without fear. The profound solitude that had been her constant companion for so long suddenly felt unbearable in its absence. She wanted this. She wanted the safety, the protection, the impossible dream of a life without shadows. I, I agree, she whispered, her voice raw, barely audible, but firm with conviction. The words were a surrender, yes, but also a reclamation. In accepting his terms, she was not giving up herself, but finally allowing herself to be found, to be cared for. A fragile, trembling hope, like the first tentative bloom after a long, harsh winter, blossomed in her heart. It was a new, unfamiliar sensation, a warmth that spread through her veins, chasing away the lingering chill of despair. Alaric's grip on her hand tightened ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her acceptance. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a softening of his stern features that transformed his face in a way Eleanor had never witnessed. His relief was palpable, a quiet exhalation of breath that seemed to fill the room with a sense of peace. The tension that had coiled between them for weeks, for years, finally began to unwind, replaced by something entirely new and infinitely more delicate. Their eyes locked again, a shared, understanding gaze passing between them. This time there was no pretense, no hiding. He saw the woman he had searched for, not just a memory, but a living, breathing soul, now vulnerable and trusting in his presence. She saw the man who, despite his formidable power and relentless pursuit, had offered her salvation, a refuge she had not dared to dream of. In that shared glance, a silent pact was forged, a bond woven from vulnerability and newfound trust. It was an acknowledgement of the profound shift in their relationship, a transformation from hunter and hunted to protector and protected, to something deeper, something undefined, yet undeniably powerful. The imposing room, once a symbol of Alaric's power and her imminent downfall, now felt different. The shadow seemed less deep, the air less heavy. A sense of calm descended, a quiet understanding settling between them, a fragile truce that hinted at a lasting peace. She could almost imagine a future unfolding within these very walls, a future where she was not alone, where her secrets were not a burden to be borne in solitary anguish. The scent of old leather and polished wood, once oppressive, now seemed comforting, enveloping her in a sense of belonging she had not felt in years. As the evening closed, the last vestiges of twilight fading beyond the high windows of Thorn Estate, Eleanor realized something profound. Her secrets were now safe, guarded by a man whose influence spanned entire regions. The weight of her past, the constant anxiety of exposure, had been lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of security she had almost forgotten. But more than that, more than the mere safeguarding of her identity, her heart had found a new, powerful, and utterly unexpected keeper in the Duke who had once relentlessly hunted her. He had not just found her. He had claimed a part of her she hadn't known was lost, a part that now beat with a fragile, burgeoning hope for the future. What would you have done? One line in the comments. Let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.